On a bright sunny day, a guy named Frank finally walked out of prison after spending a whopping 14 years locked up. Frank wasn't just any guy. He used to be a big-shot mafia boss running all kinds of shady businesses in New York City. But stepping back into the world, he quickly realized things had changed. His old power was gone. The Colombian and Chinese drug lords had taken over, wiping out Frank's old crew and taking control of the trade and prostitution rackets. Meanwhile, somewhere across town, Emilio, a big name in the Colombian prostitution scene, left his place and headed to a payphone. Out of nowhere, bullets came flying, and Emilio was killed on the spot. To make their message loud and clear, the shooters dumped a newspaper next to his body that had an article about Frank's release. At the same time, in a swanky hotel room, a guy named Jimmy was busy making a drug deal with King Tito, one of the top Colombian drug bosses. Jimmy was talking nonstop, and it was driving Tito nuts. Annoyed, Tito suddenly jacked up the price by 10%, leaving Jimmy in a tight spot. With no other option, Jimmy handed over a suitcase. But when Tito opened it, it wasn't full of cash, it was stuffed with tampons. Before Tito could react, Jimmy whipped out a gun and took him and his crew down without mercy. After taking care of Tito and his men, Jimmy met up with Frank at another hotel. Turns out, Jimmy's crew was the one who had taken Emilio out earlier. Frank, back in charge, welcomed the crew and got an update. Jimmy filled him in. Emilio and Tito were out of the picture, just like Frank had ordered, and their money and assets were now in Frank's hands. Jimmy also mentioned a meeting lined up with a middleman named Delizio, which got Frank interested. Later, Frank headed to a fancy venue where his lawyers, a few politicians, and even a district judge were waiting for him. At the meeting, Frank approached Delizio and asked for his help in setting up a meeting with a drug cartel boss named Clay. Frank acted like he was all set to get his old business empire rolling again. After their chat, Delizio headed to a gambling den to talk to Clay, who was chilling with his crew. But when Delizio brought up Frank's request, Clay wasn't having it. He laughed off the idea of dealing with Frank, calling him out for working with rival gangs, and said he preferred sticking to business with the Colombians. Clay sent Delizio back with a flat-out no. Meanwhile, Frank and one of his associates, Jennifer, were riding the subway together. The two were having a good time until 3 thugs showed up, trying to mess with Frank. But when they caught sight of the gun tucked under Frank's jacket, their courage vanished. Instead of lashing out, Frank surprised them. He handed them a wad of cash and invited them to meet him at his hotel later. Not long after, Delizio passed on Clay's rejection to Frank. Wasting no time, Frank and his men made their way to Clay's location. Frank laid it out. He was back in the game, and from now on, everything would run through him. Clay wasn't willing to budge, though, so Frank ended the standoff the only way he knew how, with a gun. With Clay out of the picture, Frank started rebuilding his network, pulling his old allies back into the fold. He even paid the mayor a visit, demanding to know why funding for a Bronx hospital hadn't been released. The mayor claimed there was no budget for it and challenged Frank to raise $16 million himself. To everyone's surprise, Frank agreed, despite his lawyers warning him to let it go. Later, while Frank was relaxing with a drink, 3 detectives, Tommy, Roy, and Dennis, showed up and hauled him away. His lawyer tried to intervene, but the detectives weren't listening. They took Frank to a deserted alley, where they showed him an injured, unconscious man named Enrico. Frank denied knowing anything about it, which only made the detectives mad. But without solid proof, they couldn't do much. It turned out Enrico was a Colombian cartel boss, and the detectives suspected Frank's involvement in the recent deaths of several key figures, all of which had happened after his release. In another part of the city, Delizio met with Wong, a triad boss, in a movie theater. Delizio passed on a business proposal from Frank, but Wong was firm. He wanted cash up front for a 220-pound shipment. Knowing Frank didn't have that kind of money, Delizio suggested a meeting between the two to work out a deal. The next day, Jimmy stopped by a fast food joint, where he handed some cash to an old lady and her grandkids. But before he could leave, cops and detectives swarmed the place and arrested him. They had Enrico's testimony linking Jimmy to multiple murders of Colombian gang members. While Jimmy was in custody, Frank paid a visit to the struggling hospital in the Bronx. Determined to make something happen, he brought up the deal with Wong again. Frank proposed they team up, sell the goods together, and split the profits to fund the hospital. But Wong wasn't interested. He still wanted cash up front. Back at the hotel, Frank got word about Jimmy's arrest. Fueled by anger and determination, he gave his crew clear orders: do whatever it takes to get Jimmy out of jail, and do it fast. Later that night, Jennifer and the gang were tasked with springing Jimmy from police custody. When the three detectives showed up and saw what was happening, they were fuming. Jennifer, staying cool as ever, warned them that if they didn't back off, they'd have to deal with a legal showdown. Not long after, Frank and his crew rolled into Chinatown. They quickly pinpointed the Chinese gangs and didn't waste time. Every single one of the gang members was taken out in brutal fashion. Once the bloodbath was over, Frank and his men captured Wong, forcing him to spill the beans on all his assets. Unfortunately for Wong, giving up everything he owned didn't save him. Frank still had him eliminated. A few days later, Frank made a massive donation that helped the Bronx hospital finally open its doors. This bit of good news didn't sit well with Dennis, though. He was steaming, convinced Frank had become the untouchable king of New York while he and his fellow officers were stuck in dead-end jobs. Dennis ranted about how Frank's wealth made it impossible to catch him through the system. Fueled by frustration, Dennis suggested they take a different route, launch a full-on attack on Frank, turning the whole thing into a gang war of sorts. Roy, however, didn't agree with Dennis's wild idea, but Dennis ignored his protests and forged ahead. One night, Frank's crew was having a blast at a club, partying hard, while Frank himself was making some business calls. After a while, Delizio showed up, bringing along a drug cartel boss from LA. This guy had heard Frank had a 200-pound item from Wong and was eager to buy it. But there was a catch: he couldn't pay the full price up front. Instead, he offered half now and the rest after selling it in LA. Frank wasn't having it. He insisted on selling it all in one go. The guy then asked for time to check out the goods first, but things took a turn when he stepped outside. Out of the blue, he killed one of the guards, revealing he'd been plotting with Delizio. Chaos erupted as armed men stormed the club. In the middle of the gunfight, Frank managed to get Jimmy out of the mess, but as they sped off, one of the attackers clung to their car door. When Jimmy tried to knock the guy off, they realized he was a cop. Frank, without a second thought, grabbed a fire extinguisher and brutally took him out. The other attackers, who turned out to be Tommy and Dennis, weren't giving up. They chased Frank and Jimmy in a high-speed pursuit, exchanging gunfire along the way. After a long, tense chase, Frank finally managed to shake them off. But just when things seemed to settle, Frank crashed his car into theirs. Seizing the moment, Jimmy jumped out and started shooting. Tommy quickly scrambled out of the wreck to go after Jimmy, but Dennis couldn't find Frank in the wrecked car. Under a nearby bridge, Jimmy shot Tommy, unloading more rounds until Tommy was critically injured. But then Dennis showed up and fired back, killing Jimmy on the spot. Dennis tried to save Tommy, but it was too late. His partner didn't make it. Devastated and full of guilt, Dennis left Tommy's funeral early. As he sat in his car, lost in thought, another vehicle pulled up. The window rolled down, and there was Frank. Without a word, Frank shot Dennis, ending his life before casually walking away. Back at his base, Frank dealt with Delizio, who had been captured by his men. During the interrogation, Delizio spilled everything. He admitted that Enrico had been working with the cops to bring Frank down. Delizio confessed he'd taken $50 million and a promise of freedom in exchange for tipping off the police about Frank's location. Enraged, Frank ordered his men to bury Delizio and the dirty money together. Later, Frank showed up at Roy's place, surprising him. Frank admitted to taking out Clay, who had scammed $13 million through shady gambling deals, as well as Wong, who had been running illegal immigrant trafficking, and King Tito, who orchestrated child prostitution in New York. Frank justified his actions, saying he only got rid of people who deserved it, even if it meant bending the law. Before leaving, Frank warned Roy he'd hire a hitman for anyone who dared interfere in his business. Before walking out, Frank handcuffed Roy to a chair. But as soon as Frank was gone, Roy freed himself and chased after him into the subway. On the train, Frank used a random passenger as a shield while Roy begged him to surrender. Instead, Frank shot him dead and calmly walked out of the station, catching a taxi. It turned out Roy had managed to land a serious gunshot wound on Frank during their clash. As Frank bled out in the taxi, the driver noticed his gun and bailed, calling the cops. Surrounded by police, Frank succumbed to his injuries and died in the car. The takeaway from all this? Living a life of crime only leads to disaster. It's way better to stay on the straight and narrow than to end up in a chaotic, bloody mess like Frank. If you've enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button, or hit it twice if you didn't like it, just to be sure. Make sure to check out the full movie to experience all the action yourself. Thanks for reading, and don't forget to subscribe for more updates.